Hello. Welcome again to an episode in the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is May 10th, 2023, and I'm delighted to have someone who's been writing a lot about economic history, who's on the front lines of making sure that we know about classical liberalism, the economy, and how people deal with different situations throughout history. And it's none other than Amity Shlaes. Amity, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Glad to be here, Vance.
Great. Well, I'm really glad to have you on as well. Been a fan of your work and reading your writings for a number of years. So it's really good to have you on the program. For the audience, I want to go over your bio real quick, just to make sure they have a good understanding of who you are as we're talking today. So Amity Shlaes is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers: The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, Coolidge, A Great Society, A New History, and The Greedy Hand, How Taxes Drive America's Crazy. Ms. Shlaes chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, a national foundation based at the birthplace of President Coolidge. The foundation's goal is to share Coolidge with Americans by hosting debate and events at the Coolidge site and through newer media. She is especially interested in education. Ms. Shlaes is winner of the Hayek Prize and currently serves on the jury for the prize, sponsored by the Manhattan Institute. In 2002, she was co-winner of the Frederick Bastiat Prize, International Prize for Writing on Political Economy, and later chaired the jury for that prize. Over the years, she has served at the Council for Foreign Relations and the George W. Bush Presidential Center, where she was one of 4 directors working on its 4% growth project. Currently, Ms. Shlaes appears in print in Forbes and National Review. A magna cum laude graduate of Yale College, Ms. Shlaes is married to fellow journalist and editor Seth Lipsky. The Lipskys have 4 children. So with all that said, Amity, the way that I like to start off these discussions is, what motivates you to do what you do each and every day?
Oh, history, definitely. When I was very young, I worked at the Wall Street Journal. And when you enter the financial world, you hear people refer to things like the SEC or the NLRB and then you say, where do those institutions come from? And in my impression, we have an insufficient understanding of the institutions that shape our lives. Joe Califano said once, a Johnson colleague and cabinet member later, said, we're living in Lyndon Johnson's America, by which he meant an America of institutions built by Lyndon Johnson. Well, that's true for all the presidents. So I like to go back to history and figure out what we can learn from the moments when these institutions were built.
No, that's exactly right. One of the ones that I was in is the acronym of OMB. Office of Management and Budget, in the president's White House. And there are a lot of acronyms that are out there. We almost need a book of some of those to make sure that we know what they are oftentimes. With your work at the Coolidge Foundation, would you mind telling us a little bit about what you do and what the Coolidge Foundation does?
Oh, well, sure. And as you may know, the OMB was essentially established under a different name.
Correct.
In the Coolidge era by President Warren Harding when Coolidge was vice president through the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, because the president didn't have any oversight over money. Really, the way I like to explain it used to work was, imagine you have 5 children and you tell them all they should get a job. And each child comes to you and says, I got a job. Now I need a car. You told me to get a job. And you say, all right. And if you see the kids one by one, and then you have 5 cars. Right.
Right.
The congressman would come with compelling bids for something and the White House would give it to them. And there wasn't really a budget process where the president had a moment to take a breath and oversee what he was doing and rationalize some of his decisions and find efficiencies. That's what Harding did. And Coolidge really exploited that OMB. It was a budget bureau at the time, it was called, in order to actually create a surplus. So the tool was there and the surplus did arrive.
That's exactly right.
So at the Coolidge Foundation, we convey these values to younger Americans. A lot of times where children are college students are not quite happy with what they're getting at college. So we try to offer up what Coolidge would have thought of various policy issues in particular, ways of living for young people, so they're at least aware of Coolidge, because unfortunately he kind of gets skipped over in secondary school history.
Yeah, it really is unfortunate. And thanks for the history, too, on the Bureau of the Budget, which was under the Treasury Department at one time, and then moved in, and the White House administered the presidential office, the executive office of the president.
I think for some reason, maybe but I think for some reason, who's the White House the president's financial advisor? That would be the Treasury, by you would think. So why did the president need this other OMB type thing? Only they can know, because Coolidge and Harding also had a super Treasury secretary who did advise them, particularly on tax policy, Andrew Mellon. So I don't know why they felt this. Maybe because the Treasury had its own interests. So a president needed to be able to gauge the Treasury's interests as well, and not have Treasury be the arbiter. But I'm waiting for that PhD thesis for someone, please, to write.
That's right. That's right. No, that's great. And why don't we kind of get started then with Coolidge? It kind of goes back to that time and in your work that you've been doing on this. And I mean, look, as we were talking about beforehand, is President Coolidge is one of my favorite presidents. He's one of the ones who, as you mentioned, doesn't get a lot of notoriety. Nobody really talks about him that much. Right. He's known as Silent Cal, where he didn't maybe say as much. But if you look at his actions and the things that he did, the economy that happened, I mean, really was one of the first ones to say, along with Andrew Mellon, just Treasury Secretary, to be kind of a supply sider in the sense of let's cut taxes, let's cut government spending. And we saw kind of the roaring 20s that happened. But I'd love to hear your take about Calvin Coolidge and some of the things that you learned and things of that nature from the book.
Oh, absolutely. We did this backwards, and that's my fault. But I want to mention the Coolidge Foundation, the main way we acquaint young people with Coolidge is through the Coolidge Scholarship process. The Coolidge Scholarship is currently the most competitive in America. It is harder to get than a Rhodes Scholarship. We have only 4 or so per annum, and this year we have 4,100 candidates. It is an academic merit scholarship, and we do look at quantifiable measures of performance and knowledge. So it's very, it's traditional, I would say, in terms of how we review the candidates. So one of the purposes of that scholarship application is to acquaint young people with Calvin Coolidge. So we have 2 essays on Calvin Coolidge required to apply for our Coolidge Scholarship. And we hope people enjoy it and don't think of the process as pain. Coolidge is a lovely guy. Whatever your political inclination, you can find something to like in him. Coolidge was not, I wouldn't call him a supply sider, but I don't want to impugn the motives of the supply siders either, or impugn them. Coolidge was a gold standard person, and you have to give the monetary regime credit. The monetary regime, which at the time was a version of the gold standard, made it very pricey for the U.S. to run a deficit. Because if other countries thought we weren't on sound financial footing, well, they would take their gold out of America, and gold was our monetary base. And that would force an automatic contraction on the U.S. economy. So if you wanted to spare your voters a recession, a contraction, bank trouble, you had to balance the budget. I think Coolidge was naturally virtuous, and he as good as Ronald Reagan or whatever. But on top of that, you want to have a serious analysis of the gold regimes, and there's insufficient appreciation for them, however imperfect. You know, conservative economics or free market economics is a battle between among groups, a battle with multi sort of 3 or 4 parties, all more like, let's say, a skirmish of people, right? Different views. And monetarists don't like that argument. Okay. The gold people don't like the monetarists and are mean to the monetarists. This is a silly fight. Let's just go back and look and see what worked. In that period, in addition to the discipline of the requirement, right, and the strong incentive to balance your budget, and Coolidge had that, the U.S. was in a race with Britain to become the world's financial center. At that moment, we were ahead, but we hadn't won the way we feel we have now. Oh, God, we're the currency of reserve. Nothing bad could ever happen to us. We move with impunity. It wasn't like that then. Any minute, Britain could overtake us. And there are considerable advantages to being number one, as we see today here in the United States. When we do something wrong, we get forgiven. So Coolidge's culture, and he too, I think, was bent on sustaining America's recently acquired number one status. What he did was he said, I'm going to balance the budget and I'm going to cut taxes, both cut tax rates. So he did balance the budget. That came from his New England roots and also from his there we're talking temperament beyond the incentives and disincentives I just described, and a natural sense of frugality. You know, his father lived in a farm town, right? they weren't in poverty because they had assets, but the assets were very hard to liquidate. It wasn't like a cash bank account. It was a cow or a house or a piece of farm equipment that needed repair but cost a lot. It was worth the repair. So that's his cultural background. And then he'd been governor of Massachusetts. So he'd managed a state budget, and governors know about budgets because they do often have to balance them. So there you are. But along with that, Coolidge understood that business needs to let America prosper, as you put it. Business needs an environment that's not too bad. And we won't say perfect, but not even, you don't need optimal. You need not too bad. The weather needs to be, the economic weather needs to be not too bad. And Coolidge's, the tax rates coming out of World War I, the top marginal rate in the income tax was over 70%. Let's see. And a second point is rarely made, and I only say this because you're more on the economic end, Vance, is it wasn't clear what the capital gains tax rate was. And capital gains tax, very important for business. Business will go on strike if the cap gains rate is too high. And they had a strike. It was called the capital strike in the early 20s. Because some people thought, remember all these taxes are young, that maybe cap gains should be taxed as ordinary income, which would mean they'd be subjected to that 77% or 73% or 70% rate. Well, so two clarifying things. I want to give Harding some credit here. Harding and then Coolidge did. Harding was president before Coolidge. He was elected. Coolidge was his vice president. Did was, along with establishing the Bureau of the Budget, the Treasury and Congress and the White House agreed, by and large, through law and regulation and determinations, that the cap gains rate should be about 12.5%. That was an enormous relief to markets. No, in theory, cap gains should be zero. Didn't matter. As long as it's set at a certain rate, that's the question, and a lot of us look at the cost of uncertainty. I mean, the main thing about Coolidge was uncertainty was reduced. And then Harding and then Coolidge said, we're going to take taxes down as fast as we can. And they did take over a number of tax cuts. They had to do it slowly and with great contests in Congress. They did get the top marginal rate on the income tax down to 25% and also cut rates for lower earners. If you have a mind to write a dissertation about this, the statistics of income from the 20s are a regular, Michelangelo for tax people. They are a work of art because Mellon was a serious man and a serious financier. So his taxes were just gorgeous. The way he displayed it, SOI, they're still there. If the Treasury hasn't taken them down, which I don't think they will, for you to peruse and see that when they cut the rate, of course, and this gets at the supply side question. Modern supply siders talk about when you cut the rate, you get more activity and you narrow how much you lose, or you even make more than you would have before. That was definitely the truth in the 20s. When they cut the tax rates, activity increased. So there were not the revenue losses you would expect from doing a static analysis on paper.
That's great. And
that was a long answer, but for econ.
No, that was great. It was good, and I'm glad you went through that because there's a lot from that period that most people either don't know or don't understand. And what was interesting too, I believe it's right, is that you had spending was either cut or stayed about flat from the time of Harding to the end of Coolidge, which is extraordinary.
I can't remember about Harding, but I think he did cut the budget, and so did Wilson. By the way, coming out of the war, they had a big war, World War I, after the war. But in terms of peacetime presidents, because Coolidge was president. We should have said that earlier. Yeah. He's number 30. And he was president from 1923, when Harding passed away, to 1929 March. They had inaugurations in March then. 67 months or so. The budget was no larger when he left than when he came in. And that is the stunning feat, because the economy grew at about 4% real and the population grew. So, where Vance used to work, they would say spending per capita.
Right.
Often, because you have to look at how big the economy is or how many people there are. Spending per capita went way down because population went up, but just spending dollar for dollar, year over year, real or nominal, it was lower when he left. And that was quite quite a feat.
It really is, especially given today, we're running these $2 trillion deficits and $31.4 trillion national debt and everything else. I mean, it is quite the feat. And it is one of the reasons why Coolidge is one of my favorite presidents. I mean, there was a lot of other things that were going on at the time. Secretary Mellon, I've also read his book, Taxation, which is a really good book that talks a lot about his philosophy on taxation and everything else. And I think that really set the stage for what could have been a lot of good pro-growth policies for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, then we had a period of time where, they came in with the Great Depression. And I think maybe we can move there next to the forgotten man. Was there anything else that you would like to mention about Coolidge before we moved on?
Oh, absolutely. I like him very much. I would love to find more supporters for the Coolidge Foundation, which is basically an alternate universe to explain to young people common sense economics. It's not a college, but it is an educator. And we have high school debates. And this year, actually, kids are debating Coolidge, the proposition Coolidge should be moved to top 10 rank among presidents. Currently, he's, I think, 24. So both sides, it'd be really fun. So if you want younger people to get more knowledge in a serious environment, we're here to do that. And our scholarship, the popularity of our scholarship, which is basically young people going like hummingbirds to an older world because they don't like the current world and their parents, please support the scholarship because it's a beacon in the sky to honor merit and Coolidge values. Okay.
That's great.
The question about Calvin, and you go calvincoolidge.org or just or email our office. We don't take, last of all, I'll say we don't take government money from the federal government currently.
Excellent.
We have in the past, and that's because Coolidge was kind of uncomfortable with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
He would work with the state, and we work with the honored state of Vermont. If you want to visit us in Vermont, we have the most beautiful setting there, but we don't really work with the federal government in terms of taking grants right now, and we're proud of that. But it makes us all the weaker in terms of finance. Okay, so the question people always ask about Coolidge is, did he cause a Great Depression?
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed, let's see, various economists will drop that. I won't say their names. When they feel like it, they'll say, yeah, you kind of did. We do have a monograph by the foundation on our website addressing that for your students. But the answer is, if you want to answer like Coolidge, did Coolidge cause the Great Depression? The answer is no. Right. And if you want to delve into that, of course we can.
Yep. No, I agree. I agree with you. And I think it was a lot from what happened with the next president with Hoover and the things that happened along with the Smoot-Hawley tariff act that went into place, along with raising taxes, a lot of the subsidies that were going on. They started running deficits. They started raising taxes. So a combination of those things, in my view, slowed down the economy, along with some of the monetary things as well, as you had the Federal Reserve reducing the money supply at a rapid rate. There were a lot of things that were going on. And then that contributed, in my view, to the Great Depression. I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on that, which really kind of gets into another one of your great books, The Forgotten Man. And so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on maybe about the Great Depression, about the book, The Forgotten Man, and some other things that you'd like to discuss along those lines.
Oh, thank you. Well, The Forgotten Man was published in 2007. I'm very honored people still read it. And actually, I should just amend a bit. The Forgotten Man graphic is a cartoon book I wrote. And it was drawn by a brilliant artist named Paul Rivoche. It has 1,800 images from the Great Depression, which you can break into slides and teach with, by the way, because a lot of us teach with PowerPoint. And that book is the cartoon version of Forgotten Man. I just love it. Sometimes people get upset when they order the wrong one, but I just love it. And I could say that because I didn't draw it. Paul Rivoche did. I just helped out with the words. Okay. The Forgotten Man was a book about the Great Depression. I'll say two things. One, where does the title come from? And then two, what happened in the Great Depression? As people know, President Roosevelt, before he was president, when he was campaigning, gave a speech on the Lucky Strike Hour, where he spoke of the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So that would be the poor man. We want to help him. Of course we do. We have charitable souls. It's Christian, whatever. I don't mean to be flippant, but that seems uncontroversial.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who was involved, there were many people involved in writing that speech, but one was Ray Moley, who I like very much. He's one of the hidden figures who changes lives, kind of like John Taylor of Stanford. He's an economist. He was a high official in the government, but he's also changed a lot of lives, and nobody knows that, by showing leadership to people. He's a Nobel candidate. Anyway, this Moley changed a lot of people's lives, including mine even. So Moley noticed all this, and Roosevelt gave the speech, Forgotten Man. But the original Forgotten Man phrase was not Franklin Roosevelt's. It came from a philosopher who taught mainly in the preceding century, William Graham Sumner of my alma mater, Yale College. And Sumner had a little algebra where he said A, the person at the top, I suppose, or a citizen A wants to help X, the man at the bottom. That would be. So does B, maybe. So A and B get together and they pass a law to help X. Okay. But in the process, they have to coerce C, some random fellow who's going to be paying taxes for this, and who might not benefit from the law and may even be hurt. And Sumner said, C is the forgotten man, the regular taxpayer who is hostage to a sometimes good but often dubious government project got up by A and B, by his peers or someone fancier than he is. And Sumner said, C is the forgotten man, the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of. So is X your forgotten man, the very poor man, the homeless man, or C, the forgotten man? And all through the years, they debated this, and they were well familiar with both, though Roosevelt kind of ignored the C concept. And that helps to explain the political economy of the New Deal. Roosevelt isolated groups of X's who were really in trouble indeed, and did something for them at cost to C. And the C was not only the average citizen, but the U.S. economy. If you look at what happened in the Great Depression, you want to be sure and ask yourself, is a crash always a depression? Of course, there was a crash in 1929 and 30. And of course, the market went too high and the market went down very dramatically. But crashes like that, and there have been dramatic crashes like the one of 29 every few years. In Coolidge's life, for example, there were 5 or 6, had led to pretty quick recoveries. Jim Grant, the author, has a book called The Forgotten Depression about a dramatic crash in the early 20s that nobody remembers because it was so short. What made the depression was the duration and the severity of the unemployment. 10 years of 1 in 10 or more, right? Sometimes 20% unemployment. And what I discovered, and here I'm not alone, was every year there was a different main reason that the recovery chose to stay away. It could be monetary, it could be international. We've all studied these things. It could be banking, but it definitely wasn't monetary and banking alone that made the whole 10-year tragedy. So what is it that made the tragedy? There's some other factors later. One understudied, I recommend the work of Lee Ohanian and Harold Cole, and this was that the labor price was too high. The government forced the labor price up. Pay people well so they'll spend. A theory that wasn't what you do when the government is forcing you to pay more than you have. You lay off a few people or don't rehire so fast. Mm-hmm. Just basic common sense. Anyway, the 2 factors in the book I looked at were economic uncertainty and the cost for the economy to that, and the labor. Those are the 2 new areas I was particularly interested. But if you're going to say writ large, dear children, what made the Depression different? Government intervention in different forms. Arbitrary, often wrong-headed intervention. So you think of an elephant in a room or whatever metaphor that comes to your mind. And my favorite economist, who's way undertaught, was a guy named Benjamin Anderson, who was not exactly like some side figure. He was the chief economist of Chase Bank. And he wrote a notice every week. You can go back and get the newsletters. And his work is summarized in a book called Economics in the Public Welfare, Benjamin Anderson, published in the late 40s. Anyway, he said, look, children, the Depression was caused by the government playing God. And when the government failed, play God. The recommendation and the thought was government must just play God more vigorously. And I found that absolutely captured. The government played God, and when it failed, trying that out, it played God more vigorously. So it's a wonderful period to study when you think about how much should government do and what can the private sector do.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you're right. I mean, we have these government failures. We often hear about market failures, but people often forget the government failures, which oftentimes are greater, are worse on people and the economy than any sort of perceived market failure that there might have been. So I really like the way that you put that overall. And I agree with you. I think that the programs that FDR put in place and the minimum wage, it's there, Social Security Act, there's a lot of things that were expansions of government that started small and then continued to grow to what we have today. And I
want to say one other thing.
Yeah,
I mean, when you go after an industry, you're gonna throw up or enjoy it. But there's a line from a Taylor Swift song that some people I know like. It goes, "Don't you worry your pretty little mind. People throw rocks at things that shine." People throw, and that is true, people throw rocks at things that shine. So when you have an industry that really charms you, and that would be tech now, people believe, whatever they say, are deeply charmed by Google. They're charmed by Twitter. They're charmed by new AI that will write an essay for them. They think this is kind of neat, right? It makes them also want to destroy it. People throw rocks at things that shine. And you see that in the antitrust movement today. Antitrust is basically a bogus concept, as far as I can tell. I really don't. It's not rules based. Usually, it's arbitrary. Right. That's the heart of the problem. So, in the 30s, there were, think of today, people sort of think, oh, there's some cool pharma things going on, or, whatever was charming, and also had the potential, by the way, to pull the economy out of the doldrums that the administration went after, and that's the lesson for us too. In particular, electricity, utilities. Well, America was electrifying. Let's take over electricity on the pretext poor people in the South don't have it yet. Who is to say, we don't have that experiment? We have to run a pitiful counterfactual. The South wouldn't have electrified itself without the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's what the companies involved thought was happening, Commonwealth and Southern in particular, led by Wendell Willkie. So they went after, that is the administration under Franklin Roosevelt, went after things that shone, so to speak, whatever had rich people. All right, that's fun to punish rich people, but whatever also had the prospect of pulling the economy out of the downturn. And by the way, one should mention for today, energy, which pulled us out of the last big market crash. So people throw rocks at things that shine, and we have to think, what is the cost of that?
Yep. I hadn't thought about it that way, but now I won't get it out of my head. So that's good. In the last few minutes we have here, Amity, I really like for you to talk a little bit about The Great Society, another one of your good books that's really out there that I hope the audience will go out and buy and read these books, because they're really great. You learn a lot of detail. We're not able to do it all the service that we should here within our time frame, but I think that this is another one that I'd really love for you to kind of explain, maybe in just a couple of minutes. I know that's tough, but as we're wrapping up here.
The Great Society is about the 60s. And so that's the next impulse. After the New Deal impulse comes the Great Society. And the Great Society was not a bestseller. It was a cartoon book. That's what I was getting at before. I wish it would be. I love it. I tried hard. What did I learn about this? So we're talking about the period with JFK. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson, who used that phrase and delivered a famous speech at University of Michigan, Great Society, not just good, great. And then Nixon, too. And if you look at Richard Nixon, the data, actually, he expanded programs faster than Johnson. So this is a bipartisan spending spree. I guess the surprise, it was a period where we spent a lot and thought there'd be no cost. And the cost was a decade of purgatory called the 70s. When a mortgage, well, let's just say you had 2 fewer bedrooms in your house than you expected, because mortgage was, even in the 80s, 15%. So we had to pay for that. And I really liked looking at this decade. I liked the people. They meant well. They didn't understand often what would happen. None of us does sometimes when we're trying on a new project. But if there were one big surprise, I'd say that something I didn't know when I went to look at the Great Society was the influence of organized labor. And as most, particularly in Texas, people will know, there are two kinds of state in America. There are right-to-work state and they're more heavily unionized state. State has to opt out of unionization of the heavy kind, and it can do that. And that is under the Taft-Hartley Act, which is a law from the 40s. That has allowed a real natural experiments where we can see the results, not a counterfactual. And the result has been, by and large, and you look at the back of the book, that guess what? Less unionized states did better. It wasn't just that the advent of air conditioning or the people like sun or to golf it was also, it's easier to create a job in a less unionized state. In the 60s, of course, this little loophole, this opportunity for a state to opt out, the unions, particularly George Meany of the AFL-CIO, recognized that it was an existential threat to them, the right to work, and they came this close to killing it. There was legislation, the president was behind it, the president had committed to it, that was Johnson, but there was a filibuster led by Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who was a big civil rights warrior. Many may know that name, Dirksen Building Right. There was a filibuster. Repeal of right to work did not succeed. And that was an event of enormous importance to the US economy. It was like becoming like Germany or staying America. Because we did not repeal right to work, we had, by and large, the opportunity for freer companies subsequent to the 60s, but it could have gone the other way. History is very chancy, as historians say.
Yes. Yeah. And I learned a lot from that book as well. I mean, there's just a lot of wealth of knowledge that's in there and the events that were happening. And to your point, I think you're exactly right. Under President Nixon, the expansion of government was greater. And you don't always hear that compared to under LBJ. But there was a massive growth of government during that period. And it's quite fascinating just to kind of go back through our discussion we've had today of Coolidge and kind of reining in government, trying to make sure it doesn't grow. And we saw the roaring 20s, the expansion of government from Hoover and then FDR and the Great Depression that we had there, then the Great Society and the lessons that we should learn from that. And then the 70s that were the result of that. And now today we're facing a lot of those issues that I hope we can learn from the past. And that's why it's so great to have you on the program, Amity, because I don't think we're learning the lessons that we should from those times before. And so just for the last minute here, what would you like to say as the last words for the audience?
Oh, I just want to say thank you. I mean, the main issue for parents and us is the history of the 20s. What is that? Well, it's told by The Great Gatsby, right? That is the number one history book on the 20s that your son or daughter will confront you with. So you have to counter that. And first way you counter it is recall that The Great Gatsby was published in 1925 and written in 1924. So it certainly could have been describing the 29 crash, the way teachers think. It's describing the crash of the early 20s from which the U.S. economy recovered. So if just find ways to look into the data. This is not right, left, fight, fake news. Yeah. The data tell the story. The data are there. The evidence is there. There was nothing unsolid about the growth of the 20s. Or let's say there was nothing. It was very real. There were pockets of speculation, Florida real estate, but by and large, the 20s were a memorable, wonderful decade. And don't let anyone take that away from you with any Great Gatsby talk.
Well, I certainly won't. Thank you, Amity. Thank you for everything that you're doing. God bless you and your family. And for the audience, thank y'all for listening today. I hope you'll rate this a 5-star rating and share it with your family and friends. Go out and purchase some of these books. I think there's some great books that you're going to learn a lot of information, and be sure to check out the Coolidge Foundation. Until next time, let people prosper.